weeks now? Is this week 4? This is week 4, isn't it? So who thinks we're going to get through everything in 2 weeks? But we will try to move a little faster this week. We've knocked out the really, really big stuff like, can I trust the Bible? Is there any reason to believe that what we're reading is what was written? And we just saw amazing stuff there. And then last week we talked about science and faith and just realized that we really have a bit of an artificial war, don't we, between science and faith. This idea that Christianity is inherently hostile to studying the natural world just kind of, it falls on its face when you think that science was in some sense invented by Christians of deep faith. Like, how does it work then that science could be directly antithetical to Christianity? Somehow, Christianity gave the impetus to science, we learned last week. And then when it comes to origins, right, we've just got really big divergence across the church as to how we should look at origins. And the main thing that's at stake there is simply the issue of, is the theory of evolution a bully pulpit through which we can hammer Christians to say, this is evidence for atheism? And if it is, then there's this knee-jerk reaction of Christians to fight it. And so what we said, I think that we can kind of look at the evidence and follow it just wherever it leads, because our creation narrative is broad enough for that. And the beauty of it is that the purely atheistic account of origins actually looks like it's scientifically flawed. It doesn't account for design. And when you don't account for the data, then your theory is kind of suspect. So, all right, so that's kind of where we've been. And now there's Shai and Christian. Yay, they're here. We thought, we know Scott and Sarah aren't here, so we're glad you guys are here. That's great. All right, so today we'll get into some more kind of social issues and Bible interpretation on ethical issues and stuff like that. And this will be another fascinating thing. We'll try to move at a little bit quicker pace. So what I'll try to do is maybe net out a couple things simply, and then if there's follow-up, then we'll let that guide where we go next. So, all right. So first, let's offer a word of prayer. God, we come to you just to guide us. We are interested in truth, and we are ready to let truth be the ultimate goal for us. And we understand that we're subjective and that we don't have all the information, but we just want to know what's true. And if you're there, then you are ultimate truth. And so we are seeking the answer to that question today. And I pray that you would illuminate the way. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, so we're going to deal with some difficult passages, and we're going to start out just with kind of the Christian marriage model. And so the first question that we had about this was the whole male headship in marriage. So we've actually got, we have like 3 or 4 different kind of references to what kind of appears to be a sort of marital order, where you have the husband identified as the head of the wife. So the question is, and it's a good one, someone asked, well, does that kind of inherently constitute a demeaning of power in the marriage relationship for the wife, or a devaluation, and all that kind of stuff? So I'm going to say this very simply, and then you guys can let the follow-ups kind of guide where we go from here. Christians kind of deal with specifically this passage. This is Ephesians 5:22. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord in 2 different ways, and it's called, the 2 different ways are the egalitarian model and the complementarian model. Tarian. Okay, what's the root word here? What does this word mean? Egalitarian. Fancy. Come on, somebody. Equal. Equal. And what's the root word here? Complementarian. Complement. Okay, so the very simple definition of the way they approach this particular passage is egalitarians believe that the dynamic between a husband and wife is defined by servant love, as defined by the Lord Jesus, and that they are fundamentally equal both in value, and no specific role designation comes out of that. It's simply like an issue of spiritual gifts. and servant leadership, and mutual submission defines the union. And the complementarian believe in a timeless principle of sort of servant leadership and mutual submission. Here, complementarians believe in a timeless principle of male headship. In other words, when I say timeless, I mean no matter what your culture is. Like, so you can have matriarchal cultures, you can have patriarchal cultures, whatever your cultural situation. The complementarians believe, hey, come on in. Complementarians believe there's a timeless principle of male headship. This is not a diminishment of female value. No complementarian believes that. Complementarians believe that men and women are both made equal in the eyes of God in terms of value, but that there's a role designation, that headship implies male initiative and leadership. So when you look at the actual passage, I just want to point out one thing, and then I want to hear your follow-up. So look at how it starts. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of his wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. First, let's note that the word head in English almost always designates authority. And what's interesting, in the Greek, the word is kephale, and head most often is used to mean source or point of origination. So in other words, it would be like when we use the word head to describe headwaters. So the headwaters of the Skagit River are in the Cascade Mountains. That's how we use it. Well, the Greeks very often used it like that. And so that actually harkens back to the creation narrative. Eve comes, everyone knows, out of Adam's rib. So males are in that narrative quite literally the source of female. Like Adam is the source of Eve. And I think that there's a good case to be made that Paul then is implying that there's a dynamic that's implied there of male initiation and female response, and that this is a beautiful dance, and that it actually models what Jesus does with his church, that he initiates in loving servanthood to his bride, the church, and the church responds in loving surrender to that love, to that initiation. Now, when you turn to the husband and you say, well, what does that imply? That implies that the husband basically gets his feet washed and gets to control the remote every night. Actually, it's kind of stirring what's being called up for husbands. So check this out. This is, by the way, in a culture, let's remember, this is a Roman context. Roman context where wives were the property of the husband. The paterfamilias, in other words, the father of the family, had absolute rights over his family. That included his wife or wives. He could have as many as he wanted, and including his slaves. And he had sexual access to all of them as well. Okay, so that's the context. Into that context, we read, first of all, monogamy, and then secondly, husbands are called to love your wives as Christ loved the church. And how did Christ love the church? He gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He loves his wife, loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, and now he's quoting Moses in the creation narrative. He's going all the way back to Genesis 2. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And let's just finish with the last verse there. This mystery is profound, but I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each of you love his wife as he loves himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So, the egalitarians will note that, let's back all the way up, James, to verse 22. The beginning of this passage is a fascinating one. Look at the first verse. Before you get to verse 22, wives, submit to your husbands. What's 21 say?
Submitting to one another.
Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. What does that mean? It's a call that the entire church submits. So submission isn't a diminution of duty or value, that everybody submits. So I'm supposed to submit to you, and you submit to me. And we surrender to each other, because the whole agape love thing that's supposed to define church is a love for the thing that is not about whether they deserve it or have earned it. That's what agape love means. And that's how I'm supposed to love you. And that means I'm going to surrender my need to your need. And so here's what I noticed, and then I'll just want to hear your follow-up on this. I've noticed that I've known, like I've counseled a lot of couples, and I've counseled a lot of couples in this camp and in this camp, and they would, so you say, well, what kind of model do you live by? And say, well, we're complementarian. We believe there's a timeless principle of headship, and the wife will agree with it. She'll say, I expect my husband to lead, I expect him to take a spiritual initiative, and I respond to his loving servanthood. And I will talk to couples who say, no, we believe in an egalitarian model, and we believe that there's no one who specifically takes the lead, but we all serve each other and we submit to one another. And we lead out as our gifts determine. And when I look at these, if they didn't tell me which model they were working on, I couldn't tell the difference. And why is that? Because look at what's being called for. If you take that passage seriously, there's some sense in which you can't read that, take it seriously, and not realize that the goal in your marriage is to race to the bottom of the totem pole. Do you understand what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's a race. It's a competition. It's a competition to who will outserve the other person. How else are you supposed to read, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for it? We were joking about this before you guys got here. James was talking about how, some guys just read that, brand new Christians, and they go, this is amazing. If this means that all Christian marriages mean I get everything I want if I'm a man. And it's like, I don't think that giving yourself up means that at all, right? In fact, it probably means the opposite of that most often. And I'm not the first person to make the observation that the call for husbands here seems to, in some sense, almost be the more stringent, just because they are called to sacrifice their lives. Because if the model is Jesus, we know what Jesus did. He actually laid down his life for his bride. Questions? Let's talk about that. So, thoughts about how that works out in reality and all that stuff?
Is submit really? It feels like more of a respect.
That's a great point because he could have used the word obey, right? But he doesn't.
Right.
The word obey is in this passage. You keep scrolling down, James. If he wanted to use the word obey, he could have, but he didn't because he uses it for children. Mm-hmm. Verse 1. So Paul has ready access to the word if he meant that wives are to obey their husbands. Respect is the way he actually concludes. So when he summarizes, his summary statement is verse 33. You see that? So he's made the profound argument, right? He's tying the whole thing to the creation narrative. Eve comes out of Adam. Adam's the source of Eve. There's this beautiful dynamic of loving servanthood. And then he says, okay, now let me put a bow on it. Let each of you love his wife as he loves himself. So that much love, like as much as I love me. So if I love me and I think I'm awesome and I should have all the things, then I should love you that same way. And you are awesome and you should have all the things. You see what I mean? So it's a stirring call to selflessness on the part of the husband. And then the wife is called to respect, not the word is not obey, but to respect. And respect will probably include surrender at times. Yes, for sure. It will surrender to his loving initiative. Yeah. So like I said, whether you're in this camp or this camp, and in this camp, there's no fundamental argument about who's the boss. And yet these people walking in a biblical model are constantly deferring to the other, which is fascinating, right? And then similarly here, this model has a very specific headship, and it belongs to the husband, and yet the husband is constantly giving himself up. So it's kind of cool that I've watched couples walk this out. Seriously, you almost can't tell the difference unless you sit them down and you say, "Oh yeah, my husband's supposed to be the head, and he's not." Leading me, I get that a lot from Christian wives. He's not initiating is the word. And that's if you're in this model and you feel like your husband is failing to be the head. And similarly, of course, you can be here and the complaints are just simply that, whenever he treats me like I'm his slave, I get that too. So. All right, should we keep going? Anything else on that? Okay, let's keep going.
One quick question.
Yeah.
And it's a little bigger than just this subject matter, but I think we can agree that each individual word in the Bible is not from God's mouth, but is inspired by God's.
Yes. Yes.
So how can we determine how much cultural bias filters into the Bible? Like that the person that's transcribing it, his personal bias, his feelings about male-female relationships or manservants and maidservants versus what God's true intent was.
Well, like James showed us on week 1, that what we have to convince us that cultural realities are maybe present but not overriding the text is when the text tells us something completely countercultural. And this whole model is not normal.
Right. And I mean, that was when subsequent people were writing it down, right? But I'm talking about the original author. The first time, right, that it's written down.
Yeah.
How much of this,
Yeah,
God might have said it slightly differently.
No, okay, so what we can do is, like we said on the week 1, we can pull the author's personality out of Scripture. God does not override the author's personality or even his cultural lenses. You can see that. But you can also see where the author is utterly carried on up and above his circumstance. And the reason why is when he says stuff like this.
Because it's countercultural.
It's utterly countercultural. It's not even,
So you'd have to, if you were going to make the argument that it was altered in some way, you'd have to find evidence of that in the variants. So that's one way to argue.
Oh, yeah. Is that what you're getting at?
And then the other way to argue it
That
is,
subsequent transcribers edited it down. We've kind of already covered that, though, haven't we?
yeah, I mean, that's one way to argue it. The other way is what you're saying is, well, how do I know that this doesn't contain bias? Well, it's easy. It's this statement is completely countercultural to that time and overrules bias.
Well, the horrible example would be Joseph Smith really wanted multiple wives.
Yeah.
So God told him to have
Oh, well,
multiple
let's keep going because that's a specific question.
Oh,
So that's a specific question of interpretation. So number 9 is we'll come back to it because I think polygamy is in there. Why do we not keep the Sabbath even though it's the Fourth Commandment? And the case I make is that there is moral, this will actually cover a lot of territory. This is a big interpretation principle. Moses includes 3 different kinds of law. So in Moses, we have the moral law, we have ceremonial law, and we have civil law, okay? And I'll give you an example of each. Moral law, do not murder. There's moral law, okay? And ceremonial law is don't shave your head.
Oh, James.
Above, wait, it gets specific. Above the ears, okay? Above the ears. And then the civil law is return 4 sheep for 1 stolen. Okay? So there's 3 different kinds of Mosaic law. And only one of these moves forward into the New Covenant period. Only one of these. Which one? The moral law. This is the only one that moves forward. And why would we make that interpretive decision? Well, because of explicitly the way Jesus taught, the way the apostles taught us to look at the law. And when they say that Christ is the end of the law, Christ is the end of the law, this is what they mean. They do not mean that Christ abolished do not murder as a moral guideline. It means that Christ has fulfilled the intent of the law, that he has fulfilled its purpose. He has lived the perfect life. He lived the perfect lawful life that we could not live, and that he has done away with the way that the ceremonial law looks forward to grace or points its finger on human depravity and sin and need for grace. That, in fact, was the point of the ceremonial law and the civil law. So now when it comes to civil laws, the Christian, so this carries forward. This is, in some sense, nullified. And Hebrews 10, can you look that up? It's got Hebrews 10:1 kind of gives a very eloquent summary of why we don't follow the ceremonial law. And then civil law, Christians are called to submit to the governments where they're living. So you can't very well follow Moses' civil laws and follow the civil laws of Afghanistan or the civil laws of China or the civil laws of Japan, if you're a Christian in those countries, you are called to submit to the government where you live. Okay? And you say, well, what if the government is evil? Well, then there's another principle that trumps that, whereas if the government calls you to disobey moral laws, then you are to obey God rather than the government. Okay, these are interpretive principles. So when it comes to the Fourth Commandment, I believe that all 10 of the commandments, the big 10, are moral. And they all carry forward into the New Testament, every single one of them. Now, there's some debate about the fourth. Some will say that because of the way Jesus handled the Sabbath, he allowed, for example, his disciples to thresh on the Sabbath. You guys remember there's a story where they're walking along the field, they grab some wheat, they thresh it, and they eat it. And someone looks at them and says, look at your disciples, they're eating, or they're threshing on the Sabbath. And they were super legalistic about it. Like, this is threshing, like, so just taking a few kernels. And so Jesus says at that point, this man was not made for the Sabbath was made for man. And at that point, he's not nullifying the Sabbath. He's carrying it forward as a moral principle, but he's trying to undo the legalistic baggage. So for example, the Jews had wrapped themselves around the specifics of rest, because that's the command, right? Do not work on the Sabbath. They had wrapped themselves so around the legalities of it that they had forgotten the principle, which is Sabbaths for us. It is actually a moral commandment that we're supposed to obey that just feeds us, that rests us, that refreshes us, and it's meant for us, Jesus said. We're not made for that law. We weren't made to submit to that law. That law, in some sense, works for us. Now, does that mean we can just ignore it? If it's for us, I choose not to use it. No. There's a moral principle that moves forward. So the question I asked her, I can't remember who this was, which one of you asked, but I think that we still ought to keep the Sabbath. Now, you say, well, we're not keeping it on Saturday. You're right, we're not. And the Sabbath, by the way, that's what Saturday comes from. The root word comes from the word Sabbath. Does anyone know what the word Sabbath means, by the way? What's the English rendering of that word if you turn it straight into our language?
Day of rest.
Rest. The word, not day of rest, just rest. The word Sabbath means, so take a Sabbath means take a rest or a pause. It literally means a pause or a rest. So the principle of rest moves forward into the new covenant in the same way that do not steal moves forward, even if we no longer offer sheep, which is part of the ceremonial law, or we don't worry about tattoos, or keeping your head unshaved above the ears. By the way, do you know that's why Hasidic men have little braided hair? Have you guys ever seen that? Hasidic Jewish men have braided hair here. That's because the ceremonial law says do not shave your hair above the ear. And so they're still obeying that ceremonial law, and you, Christian, are not. Why not? It's in there. It's in the Bible. Why not? Because we have an interpretive reason given to us by Jesus and his apostles to say this no longer goes forward. Does that mean that those ceremonial laws are bad? No. They're there for a purpose, and they were there to show, for example, you know why God gave that silly rule to us? Seems like a silly rule. Do you know why he gave that rule? Because the Canaanites, where the Jews were entering into their land, shaved their heads in their ceremonial practices. And it was part of their cultic rituals, which included infanticide. In other words, people brought their babies into temples and had them slaughtered for their gods, and all sorts of sexual debauchery. So they said, look, I don't even want you to look like those guys. Don't even look like those guys. So do not shave your head. It was all about separateness. So if you look at the ceremonial law, almost all of it's about separateness. It's about God having a peculiar, strange people in a good way. So that's what the ceremonial law is about. Well, once that's done its job, and it brought Israel into the era when it could bring Messiah into the world, then the ceremonial law has done its job, and it's no longer. It was just a shadow, and that's the way the Bible talks about it. It's just a shadow, and it's not the real thing.
Unless you're Orthodox Jewish and you don't believe the Messiah is coming.
Exactly.
I was going to ask about that, but people still follow.
And who does? The people who do not believe that Jesus came to fulfill the law.
So
if you don't believe that, then you're still
in the old system.
you're still under Moses. And sorry, tangent. You're basically, your religion's on pause. because a huge piece of the ceremonial and civil law revolves around temple. And guess what the Jews don't have?
A temple.
They don't have a temple. So if you don't have a temple and your religion revolves around the temple, your religion's on pause. And it is. And why do you think Hasidic Jews, guys with the braided hair and the hats, are sitting there in front of the Wailing Wall doing this? What are they praying for? To get into the temple. You need a temple. What is the Wailing Wall? Does anyone know what the Wailing Wall is? It's the base of the old temple. And they are praying to God for the restoration of the temple. Because they know, more than you know as a Christian, that the temple is central to their religion. And their religion is in some sense, I don't mean entirely, but is in some sense on pause as long as there's no temple.
So if the temple was rebuilt and their Messiah in their perception has not come, would they have to go back to sacrificing animals then?
Yes.
Absolutely. And they would long for it. They would long for that day.
Yeah, that would be a
It would be
big time celebration.
It would be the restoration of their religion in some sense. The restoration of their
Why don't
ability.
they have a temple? I don't know.
They don't have a temple because the Temple Mount was destroyed in 70 AD by Titus, and then it was basically just Jerusalem was Christianized until about the 400s, and then the barbarians kind of weakened it, but it still had a strong Christian influence. In fact, it was a center of Christian thought until Islam. And then Islam comes and demolishes the joint, and they build within 50 years, so around 700, they build what you see today.
That's Jerusalem?
No, they build on top of that Temple Mount their own mosque. So a Muslim mosque sits where the temple should sit. So now just imagine geopolitically.
Oh.
Are you with me?
That's right.
Yeah.
Geopolitically, imagine if the Jews said, we want a temple.
Yeah.
So we're just going to tear this thing down. Yeah, right? Not going to happen. And just so you know, the desire to do so in Israel is pretty low. Israel's a very secular place. So the idea to rebuild their temple is a desire of a very tiny sliver of Jewish society, the ultra conservative. All right, so that explains why we do obey the Fourth Commandment, but we obey it in a different way. We do not follow the list of rules of don't carry a plum. These are literal Jewish rules for the Sabbath. Don't carry anything heavier than a plum. Don't walk farther than a half a mile. Don't eat an egg if a chicken laid it on the Sabbath. I'm not lying. These are actual rules that were around the rule.
Okay.
So when Jesus comes along and says the Sabbath was not made for man, or man was not made for the Sabbath was made for man, he is unwinding that stuff.
Imagine how frustrated Jesus must have been. It's like, guys, all I wanted was for you to take a break. Because I know that if I don't make you take a break, you'll work yourselves into the bone, trying to get ahead or whatever.
And you won't trust me.
And you won't trust me,
It's all
and
about
there will
trust.
be no day during the week where you unplug from everything and just focus on me. You'll just,
Christians Sabbath for the same reason they tithe. They chop off a part of their income and give it that they would otherwise spend on themselves, and they just give it to God. So how are you covering that gap? I guess you're gonna have to trust God. And the same thing with your time. You just take a seventh of your time and just chop it off and say, well, I could work that day. No, you just chop it off and you give it to God. And you rest, reflect, recreate on that day instead of what you could do, which is make a ton of money. And how are you going to get ahead? Guess you're going to have to trust me. Those commandments are all about expanding our faith life. All right, so Fourth Commandment, I believe, moves forward. You say, well, why on Sunday? Well, the early church started. It was slow because they're all Jews. So then they started to celebrate resurrection on Sunday. Why? Why did they start celebrating resurrection on Sunday?
The fulfillment.
What's that?
It was the fulfillment.
Yeah, that's when Jesus did it.
Yeah.
He rose from the dead on Sunday. That's first day of the week, right? Saturday is the last day of the week if you're a Jew. So Sunday was the first day of the week if you're a Roman, and that's the day that Jesus rose from the dead. So that's why they started worshiping on Sunday, and then it just got instantiated. When are you going to do Sabbath? Let's do it on Sunday. All right. So we've actually started, I know we took a while on that one, but we started to cover a bunch of stuff because let's keep going. It's going to really come to the party on 12 and 13. So hold these interpretive questions for there. Now, we ask, did the miracles in the Old Testament, parting of Red Sea, Jonah the whale, plagues in Egypt, occur just a myth and legend? Well, we've thrown a lot of things in there. And some of those things, it's absolutely critical to the narrative of, or let me just say it this way. it's incredible. It's critical to the integrity of the Bible story that some of those events actually happen. If the Exodus doesn't happen, then there's really no there's no integrity to the first 5 books of the Bible. The entire 5 books almost they hang on whether that event happened or not. Now there are just exciting things going on in archaeology as it relates to the Exodus. So can you pull this up, James? Jabal al-Lawz, it's Lawz, Lawz, Lawz. Yeah, I think that's how you spell it. And it is a mountain in Saudi Arabia. So specifically thinking about the Exodus, the story involves about 1 million people leaving Egypt after a series of plagues, and then setting up shop, a whole cult of worship around a mountain, and staying in that desert for about 40 years. And if you're an archaeologist, you say, let's see some evidence of that. And that's one of the reasons why people doubt the Old Testament in particular, because for very many years, they searched around the purported site of the mountain of God, which is the mountain that the Jews came to, and there's nothing. There was nothing there. There's not a red shekel. Now, does anyone know geographically where the mountain Mount Sinai is located? Where do you can go there if you want to be a tourist? You can actually go there. Where is the purported mountain of Moses? That's not it. Where is it? The one that all the tourists go to? In what country? It is Mount Sinai. So it's in the Sinai Peninsula. So that Sinai Peninsula is here. So here's Israel. Here's the Red Sea. Okay. So Egypt is here. Israel's here. This is the Sinai. That's not it. There we go. That's the Sinai Peninsula. And guess what? This is the purported location of the mountain of God, the mountain of Moses. And how did we come to that location? You probably don't know. So we came to this location based on the vision of the mother of Constantine. So Constantine, you might remember that name. He's the first Christian emperor in the 300s. And he has a mom who is a devout Christian. And she believed in a vision that she saw the mountain of Moses in the Sinai Peninsula. And so that's the location. And then there's a monastery there, and you can go there and you can look at it, and all sorts of tourists go there, and archaeologists have gone there, and not one red shekel. Like, they start digging around that site. So they start digging around the purported site.
Wait, what is a shekel?
A shekel is just a coin.
Oh, okay.
It's a coin. So there's the Sinai Peninsula, and that's a modern mapping of the road system. And there it is. St. Catherine's at the bottom. St. Catherine is where the current site is located to be. But again, like, archaeologists are not impressed because they haven't found anything. Okay, but some real life Christian Indiana Joneses have just taken a couple of biblical clues. The number one is that Paul said that he took a trip to Sinai after he got saved. So he becomes a Christian, meets Jesus on the road to Damascus. Wow, whoa, Jesus is the Messiah. You got to be kidding me. This is turning my world upside down. I need to talk to God. And where does he go? He goes to Mount Sinai. He says, in Arabia. Arabia? Well, wait a minute. Arabia is then what it is now. It's on the other side. It's over here. It's in this area. And I'm talking about real life Indiana Joneses because Saudi Arabia, you may have heard, is a closed country. And you don't get in there just to do some wide open archaeological research on a Christian site. So people have had to steal away to see if there isn't any kind of evidence for the Exodus over here instead of over here. And it turns out there's really exciting stuff. And it started to trickle out. It started in the late 80s and 90s, and now it's starting to trickle out. Jabal al-Lawz is located right basically where, at the top of the green circle, where James is drawing. And it's right across from the Red Sea there. And do you have that picture that you showed us?
I couldn't find it.
Jabal as Jabal, Al.
No, I found that. I just couldn't find a good picture.
Oh, okay.
I'll try to find one.
There's Right. So what you see there is just some interesting things. There's by that mountain, there's a 12-stone pillar. Fascinating. 12 tribes of Israel. There's boundary stones. So there's boundary markers, and if you've read Exodus, you realize that God says, "Stay away from this mountain." And the top of the mountain is charred black. Fascinating. It's in a volcanic range, but it was a mountain that was supposedly covered in smoke and fire and all sorts of wild stuff. And what other? So, they found bovine inscriptions on altars, and apparently there were no. There it is, Jabal El Los. So there is no. There was no bovines. They don't think in Arabia in the 3500s BC when this purported to have happened. So the top of the mountain looks black because you think, well, that's cloud cover. It's not. It's charred black. That's black char.
From what cause?
No one knows. I mean, it's a volcanic range, so they think that's volcanic ash. But when you open it up, it's just granite. So just some fascinating stuff going on. And like I said, it's coming out in bits and pieces because it's hard to get there. And when you get there, it's basically under lockdown. The entire mountain has a fence around it. And the locals call it Jabal al-Musa, which means the mountain of Moses. So fascinating, right? So it may be that we have evidence for some of the most stirring stories in the Old Testament, and I've got a couple of DVDs if you want to borrow them on the new stuff that's coming out. For example, the evidence of Semites in Egypt, just incredible. So again, I want to underline that archaeology is a young science. It's less than 150 years old, and we keep finding new stuff.
It seems like to validate the Old Testament.
Well, right, and so this is a central part of the story, and its historicity, I make the claim, matters. You can't just say that's a myth. Yes, you could say, well, it doesn't undermine that Jesus really lived. It doesn't, but Jesus' entire ministry and everything he did on the cross is all connected directly back. Passover lamb, freedom from the law, delivering his people from slavery. Everything is built on the historicity of that event. So there is good and profound evidence for that. Now, the plagues in Egypt are a fascinating thing. If you actually look at those, some secular historians have actually found that to be utterly plausible. And you say, well, how? Because we're talking about locusts and blood. Okay, so beginning with the very first plague, the plague of blood. One secular historian that I read said, well, here's what happens every 25 years in Egypt, is that the Nile River is plagued by red plankton. And it actually takes over the place. And when it takes over the place, the Nile is literally just filled with it. It becomes undrinkable, and all the wildlife gets out. So you start to see a cascade effect if that's the first plague. So if the first plague is this red tide, the next thing that happens is all the amphibians are going to leave the Nile. And the amphibians would be frogs. And where would they go? And they would go up into people's homes, and all Egypt lives on the Nile, because if you go off the Nile, if you go there, yeah, exactly, 5 feet away from the Nile, and there's no food, or there's no food, there's no water. So everyone lived on the Nile, frogs inhabit the homes, then the frogs die, and then the next plague is flies. So you got a bunch of rotting dead carcasses, some gigantic, so now you got fly. So it's a cascade effect. Now, Christians have heard this explanation and say that's not miraculous. And I dispute that. That's utterly miraculous, especially when you consider the timing of it, that Moses comes and says, let my people go. Oh, no, I'm not going to let my people go. Okay, then God's going to send this plague, then this plague, then this plague. And finally, you have another cascade effect at the end, that you have a hailstorm destroys crops. And this secular historian, again, no interest in the historicity or the integrity of the spiritual part of the Bible, but whether this actually happened or not, says, imagine you have crops destroyed by hail and they're all wet, so they're taken off the field, and then they would be put in storage containers, and then they would start to mold, and mold can be deadly. But the thing is, firstborn would get the first, so your crop's basically destroyed, but what's left of it is wet and it's stored away wet. If it gets moldy, the first people have access to the limited amount of food are the firstborn in every family. So the firstborn in every family get moldy bread and they all die. So you don't have to believe that God zapped things to believe that this happened, that the plagues happened. To think that, and then you say, well, then it's not a miracle. Well, no. How is that not a miracle? Like the timing of things is a perfect miracle. Here's the other thing. How many saw the movie Moses, or was it called Moses? Where not Val Kilmer, but the other high maintenance actor played Moses.
Was it Prince of Egypt?
Ralph Fiennes.
No. Batman. The Batman Returns Batman.
Way
What's his
off.
name?
No.
Christian Bale?
Yes, Christian Bale plays Moses. Do you see it?
No.
Okay. In that one, it's made by okay, doesn't matter. He interprets the whole plague thing in this exact way, and not just the plagues, but the crossing of the Red Sea. And so Moses sitting there, the people have been let go by the plagues, and described just the way I described them for you. And now Pharaoh is chasing them. He said, what have I done? I let my slave labor go. I'm going back to get them. I was stupid. And on that night, as Moses is looking at the night sky, he sees a meteor. And then he's praying to God, like, you're going to have to do something here. He gets up the next morning, and the Red Sea has all pulled back into the ocean. They cross, and then it comes flooding back in. And you are left to assume that what the producer, the writer is telling you is that a great big meteor hit middle of the Red Sea. So big of a tidal wave was created by that. And you guys know what happens with a tidal wave. The first thing that happens is water is drawn away, and then a massive wave whammy. So that's the way he looked at it. And again, you say, well, that guts it of its miraculousness. Well, I mean, maybe. But what it certainly does, it doesn't gut it of its plausibility. Like utterly plausible. And again, just some fascinating stuff. There looks like there's a sea bridge across this side, right here and right here. In other words, where like it's 800 feet deep here, but it's like 50 feet deep there.
What?
So it's crossable, right? So if you did that, if the ocean was pulled away, you'd have a natural sea bridge right there. And by the way, this point is very small. It's like I think 2 miles across.
Yeah, there's a History Channel documentary
Enterprise
about
Passage.
a underwater volcano that erupts that explains like 8 out of the 10 plagues.
Right. So you can look at it that way, and it's all speculation. But the question is whether it's plausible, right? Did the miracles really happen? And then we're not left to think that every miracle is merely a natural occurrence that was interpreted supernaturally. But in my way of thinking, a God who sets up, a natural order that times certain cataclysmic events to match perfectly with the voice of a prophet, that seems pretty good to me.
Basically, if you're going to spend a lot of time making a case for removing the miraculous from the events, you're basically making the case for the omniscience of God.
Yes.
While you do it.
Yes. Because now he set up the whole entire universe to all the natural laws that set up that
So
moment.
it's almost as though he knows the future.
Yes. Yeah. All right. So are the Old Testament, any follow-up on that? So are the Old Testament narratives messed up? I mean, okay, so are we okay with these things? Let's go one example. Okay? In the example of Jephthah. Jephthah is a judge in the middle of the book about the judges. And the cycle in the book of Judges is the people screw up. They get under slavery of a foreign occupying power. A judge comes along and frees them through military action. Okay? And it just goes over and over and over again. Jephthah is one of those. And Jephthah is a judge who responds to the call when the people are under the rule of, I can't remember what, marauding power. And he says, Lord, if you'll give me victory in this battle against this marauding power, I will sacrifice to you the first thing that comes out of my house.
Don't do that.
Don't do that.
Don't do that.
So then he wins. He wins the battle and frees the people of Israel. And he comes back to his house. And what should come out of his home? his firstborn daughter. And then now there's a little conversation that they have. And he says, daughter, and he's crying. Daughter, I made a promise. I can't break my promise to God. We won in the battle. And she says, Father, if you made the promise, you have to do it. Let me say goodbye to my friends. Let me say goodbye to my friends. And you're left to assume that he sacrificed her. Now, this is where we get into another principle of Bible interpretation. The difference between prescription and description. So some skeptic comes along and says, the Bible is so dumb. It's just so immoral. It teaches people to sacrifice their children to God as honor killing for, blessing them in battle. Is that the teaching of this passage? Is that what this passage teaches? Is that what it prescribes? Or is that what it's describing? And in fact, if you read the entire text, are you finding that actually what it's prescribing is the exact opposite? Think about it for 5 seconds. I mean, this is what most people who are, you're just trying to take a pot shot at the Bible. No one thinks, more than 2 minutes into it. But imagine a Jew, a faithful Jew, makes a vow to God and then realizes, oh, this is a crazy rash vow. This is really stupid. Do they have recourse to get out of that vow? Righteous recourse. Like according to Moses? And the answer is, yeah, they do. So if you say, well, God blessed him in battle and clearly wanted him to then kill his daughter. No, because God had given him an out for making a rash vow. If a man makes a rash vow, and then Moses, there's a whole prescription in it in Numbers. If you make a rash vow, do this, and get out of it. You were stupid. Back away from your mouth is what Moses gives you an opportunity to do. So this guy is thinking that he's faithful to God. He's not faithful to God because he actually doesn't even know the law of God. It looks like to all the world he's obeying the Canaanite practice of child sacrifice and not the Jewish practice of basically, if you've made a rash vow, back away. The other thing is that how would he know whether the thing that would come out of his house, let's say he assumed it was going to be what? I mean, what did he think it was going to come out of his house? Like his favorite sheep? What were you going to say now?
A slave.
Yeah, a slave, a sheep. How would he know that what would come out of his house wouldn't be an animal? Okay, let's say he thought it would be an animal, but what? There was very specific prescriptions for what was a clean and unclean animal. So this guy, the dude's got problems and he's not faithful. You say, well, he's a judge. Yeah. Okay, but look, Exhibit A, Samson. Does anyone know the story of Samson?
Oh, yeah.
Let's get some details. Details, everybody. Samson,
Strongest.
paragon of virtue,
Yeah.
bestest guy in the world, really strong sexual self-discipline.
No.
No, right? How about the very first thing that he does? He marries a Philistine. Is there any rules in Moses about that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Huh. The first act of the judge is to disobey Scripture. That's the first act. So are we trying to say that all the judges were paragons of virtue? Answer, no. So Jephthah, the crazy mixed up, what did someone say? The crazy parts of the Bible, yeah, they're not necessarily prescribing this crazy behavior. In fact, in that particular case in Judges, it looks to all the world, if you read it deeply, that God is saying, look how messed up it got when they walked away from my law. Even the judges whom I called and blessed, like Samson was blessed with victory and Jephthah was blessed with victory, even these guys who I blessed with victory were miscreants, bad dudes on some levels. It's almost like a story of God's grace more than it is a prescription of here's how you're supposed to act. The theme verse for the book of Judges is, in those days there was no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And you can add this in parentheses. It's not in the text, but Rick will give you the go-ahead. And that includes the judges. Everyone who did what was right in their own eyes, including the judges. Samson, Jephthah, and all the dudes. So there are some parts of the Bible that you just go, man, that's just crazy. Is God prescribing that, or is God describing that? Abraham takes 2 wives. Is that prescription or description, James?
One of the important things about hermeneutics when you're dealing with Old Testament narratives is they're a record of what did happen, not what should have happened. So
There you go.
you got to make sure
That's really good.
You got to make sure you pay attention to that, because otherwise just because it's in the text doesn't mean that it has God's stamp of approval on it.
Exactly.
The scribe on the chat said she was just talking about prescription versus description last week during her apologetics class.
Awesome. That's really good. Zane.
Gold
Theo
star.
was just doing, we were just talking about that last week.
Yep.
I just wrote that down in my notes.
What is being
actually.
prescribed? What is being described? Okay, let's keep going. So how do we distinguish between which laws from the Old Testament are transferable to the New and applicable for our time? Answer? I already told you. Come on. We detailed the Moses laws to 3 categories. Which one carries forward? Which ones? Moral. You guys already know the answer. The moral law of the Old Testament carries forward. How do you know what parts of the Old Testament are moral law? Well, it begins with the 10 Commandments, and then things that hook back into it are related. And you say, well, I'm not sure. Like, for example, Leviticus 18 has lots of things about sex. So can you tie all of them back to Commandment 7, thou shalt not commit adultery? Most of them, you can. But then what you do is you just look at the creation narrative and then the new creation narrative in the New Testament and say which of these, which parts of the moral design does the New Testament carry forward? And then that will give you the key. Question about that? This is going to be massive for you guys because you're going to read the Old Testament. You're going to go, oh my goodness. I mean, crazy offerings and dead animals and polygamy and okay. What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to see. So, for example, someone once said, "Man, I can't believe the Old Testament it justifies rape." Okay, and here's the actual law: if a man has sex with a virgin, he is forced to marry her. And people just go, what? Like, that's the craziest thing ever. And that's only because we're sitting there from this crazy judgmental posture of the 21st century. Just climb inside the 30th century BC for 1 second. In that culture, virginity is very important. It's a massive part of the bride price. And that played across cultures. And if a woman did not bring that to her marriage, she was essentially unmarriable. So a man who takes away a woman's virginity takes away her dowry and he takes away her marriageability. If he takes away her marriageability, what's she going to do? You say, well, it's easy. Just go to Harvard and become a doctor. No. There were no options like that for women. What were her options? Slavery, prostitution. So the commandment is a punishment to the rapist, not a punishment to the victim. And you say, well, I could not be with a man who, took my virginity against my will. Okay, that makes sense. In that case, the Bible also says that if that situation happens, the father, who was her protector and overseer in that culture, could say no. And if he said no, then the guy still had to pay the bride price. So he had to treat her as if he married her. And so the bride price was a lot of money. And then that would be basically her income for the rest of her life, or at least the seed of income for the rest of her life, because he had taken away her marriageability, which was her ticket to security, her ticket to physical security, because your family, your children were your police force, your firefighting, your health insurance, your retirement fund. That's what your children were in that culture. And if you had robbed a woman of those things, you were required to give them back. So now you look at that law and you said, that just was the most heinous thing I can ever think of. And then you just like, okay, dude, we sit on the shoulders of giants, morally speaking, and all this ethical development comes from standing on people's shoulders, including Moses. And so here we are in the 21st century, and we look, oh, you're so stupid, right? Oh, you're so barbaric and dumb. But the principle inside the law is that a human being is an end in of themselves, including slaves and including women. And therefore, compensation is required. So slaves in Israel had rights. And that's just blows you away. Wives in polygamous relationships had rights. So you read a rule in Moses and you say, look at this guy. Moses says that if a man has a woman or a wife and he marries another woman, the second woman has to have the same amount of food and sexual favors as the first wife. And you go, oh, you're like just rolling your eyes at the whole thing. And it's like, stop for just a second from our position of ethnic and cultural superiority and say, what is God actually saying in that passage? He's saying you can't treat her unequally. She's the less favored wife. She has to have the exact same because she's worth the exact same. It's like, all of a sudden, God is turning the ship of human depravity and selfishness and power and might makes right. He's turning it around on the principle that that human, whether that person is a slave or a woman, is an end in and of themselves. And you can't treat them any way you want just because you're stronger than they are. The whole thing about what's going on inside Mosaic law, guys, is that God is turning the principle of might makes right around. And no longer does power make what's ethically right. Now, the person's value intrinsically is what makes what's right. So if you are intrinsically valuable, then I can't just kill you. But if I'm stronger than you in that economy, then I can, because it's right, because I'm stronger than you. I'll just take your stuff. I'll take your cattle and your women. And you go, hey, man. And it won't matter because you're not as strong as I am. But in a world where you're an end and I'm an end because you're made in the image and I'm made in the image, I can't do that. So the law is turning the Titanic of human depravity around. And if you don't see it, all you're doing is looking at rules about polygamy and rules about slavery. And you're going, ugh. And you're just judging. And you're not seeing that this is God turning the ship around. It's incredible. But you have to have a little bit of cultural sensitivity to see it.
Well, and slavery, from my understanding in biblical times, was indentured servitude, and it was voluntary to pay back debts in a lot of cases.
Huge point, really a good point. And in fact, we understand slavery based on the American context, right? So the American context is a race-based thing. The black man was to serve the white man because that was his lot. And it got a huge boost from Darwin, basically, in the 1860s, basically a huge boost from naturalistic science that said that humans are evolving along different paths and some are clearly superior to the others. And therefore, it is right and good that one should dominate the other, and eventually the weaker races, the way he called them, the less fit races, will eventually just be wiped out. And as I already said in week one, remember, like we said on Darwin's scale, the black man, the Aborigine was closer to the orangutan, genetically speaking, than he was to the European white. That was Darwin's scale. So that was the world of slavery in America. The ancients knew nothing about that. They didn't think, oh, well, you're black, so therefore you should be my slave. There was nothing like that. Keep in mind, it's the Mediterranean, guys. So the Mediterranean has almost every, here's Italy, and here's the Mediterranean. Okay, so you got blacks here, and you got Egyptians who have this very interesting mix of Mediterranean blood and African blood. And then you have Arabs and Semites here, and you got whites. Okay, so this is the world of the Bible. They had no such thing that these people are dumb and these people are smart. They didn't have any of that stuff. All their technology was about the same. The big driver of one of the racist narratives in the 1900s was the fact that when we showed up on the shores, we Europeans showed up on the shores of Africa and South America, is that it was like showing up in spaceships. And Europeans just thought that they were that much smarter because their technology was that much bigger. Well, we have to be better than these people because look, they still have sticks and clubs and we've got like sailing ships and stuff. In this world, there was no such disparity. They shared technology. Everybody shared technology. So no one was ahead, So you say, well, but there was slavery everywhere. Right, Dwayne. You sold yourself into slavery. Slavery was a tool mostly of economic justice and booty in warfare. Two things. If I'm here and I'm going to take you over here, I'm going to take your women and cattle and I'm going to take them back home. And I'm going to restore my coffers. And it's not because I think I'm better. Well, I do think I'm better than you because my God was superior to you in battle, but it's just. It was like, I deserve it. I beat you. I get your stuff. It wasn't, oh, you're black and you're inferior to me. You should serve me for the rest of your life. And because it was based on a tool of economic justice, you could buy your way out of it. And as you know, in the American context, that mostly didn't happen, right? If you were a freed slave or you ran away in the South, you went to the North, this is part of the problem. The North would ship you back.
Mhm.
And if you were free in the North and you found yourself in the South by accident, they would not honor your free status. You got enslaved because it was your right as a black man to be an indentured servant for the rest of your life because of your skin color. The Bible doesn't know that kind of slavery. It knows the slavery of indentured servanthood and the slavery of booty in warfare. So, hey, I kill your people, take over your country, and now you become my slave. You and your children. And if you wanted to, you could make enough money and you could buy yourself out. You could buy your own way out. Or a kinsman could buy you out. And that, by the way, is the origination of the term redeemer. So when Jesus called the redeemer, oh, it's so rich. Because it harkens back to a relative who, let's say, looks at Bree, she's been sold into slavery. She sold herself into slavery, let's say, because she had an unpayable debt. What do you have left when you have an unpayable debt? Yourself, your labor for the rest of your life. And someone comes along, and if I was a relative, I could buy you out, and only the relative could buy you out. And you became, quote unquote, the kinsman redeemer. And redeem means to buy back, redeem. Deem means to buy, to do it again. So to buy you back.
Mhm.
And when Jesus called the redeemer, it harkens this idea that we're on the slave block, and Jesus came to buy us out. Oh, it's beautiful. So we gotta look way deep when it comes to some of this stuff that looks really hooky, crazy to us. But remember that what we're bringing forward into the New Testament context is the moral law. You say, well, why do we obey the moral law? Because aren't we free from the law? And we should just obey the law of love, and then everybody should be fine. Well, we're super subjective about this, right? So my definition of what's love and your definition of what's love is just maybe going to wildly differ. So the Bible is really clear. Just love your neighbor. That's all you got to do. Just love your neighbor. Love does no harm to its neighbor. And so once you love, you fulfill the law. Yes, that's true. So then jettison the law? No. And I'll tell you why. Because this. So we retain the moral law because the moral law puts a definition around love. So I say to myself, oh, there's a grieving widow. She's really, really sad. I think I'm going to have sex with her. That will comfort her. Because that's love. Well, what should a Christian think? Why? Why not? Because I was loving. I felt love.
No, it was very selfish.
Why? Well, who defined that? Wait, where?
I don't know, but there's the Beatitudes and stuff.
Yeah, here. He said, do not sleep with your neighbor's wife. So,
You call that adultery?
yeah, it's adultery. That's adultery. There is no loving way to commit adultery. See, but it felt really loving to me.
Yikes. Sorry.
Do you understand? This is why, okay, but guys, this is really important.
Yeah.
Because we live in a world that's all people want to do. If it's loving, it's good. Well, why do you need objective measuring sticks for love? You need them because we're super subjective. So you can't just say, well, just love. You can. The Bible does actually say that. Love does no harm to its neighbor. Love fulfills all the law. Yes. For that reason, do we throw out the law? No. It's just that when I don't steal from you, if I love you, I won't steal from you. And if I love you, I won't murder you. And if I love you, I won't commit adultery with you. If I love you, I won't covet your stuff.
It's like the quote from The Truth About Cats and Dogs. Like, you can love your pets.
Yes, there
You
you go.
just can't love your pets.
Exactly. Does this make sense to everybody? This is why we retain the moral law. The moral law is a guide to love. And love is the essence of discipleship. In other words, following Jesus. Discipleship. You understand how this works? Law is a guide to how to love, and love is the essence of your call, if you're called to follow Jesus. So you don't throw out, do not commit adultery, just because you're not a Jew. It carries forward. You do not throw out, honor the Sabbath, or obey your mom and dad, or honor your mother and father. You don't throw those out, because they're part of the moral law.
So early Christians could be called to love because they already understood the moral law and they knew how to love. So by just saying love your neighbor as yourself, they already understood the context of the moral law on how to do that.
Exactly. And that's why a guy like Augustine could say something so radical as love and do what you want. And he did. Augustine said love and then do what you want.
I thought that was interesting when we were talking about the husband and wives, and it says that the husband should love their wife, but at the end it says the wife respects him. It just felt weird that there was that difference there.
Yeah, so let's go there. That's really good. I'm glad you bring it up. No. Let's not leave it, because a really profound point there. I think that there is a difference there profoundly, not because husbands shouldn't be loved. Husbands should be loved. And not because wives shouldn't be respected. Wives should be respected. But, and I'll just explain from my perspective, from the counselor's chair, and the difference in the way God's made women wildly different and men wildly different. But there is some very specific generalities that this difference of calling speaks to. And as a guy who's been married for 30 years, I know that my wife's number one desire is to be cherished by me. And I can tell you that my number one desire is to be respected by her. I desire to be respected by her. And that doesn't mean that she obeys me. It means that she thinks I can get it done, that she believes in me. And here's why. I know she cherishes me. So it's the thing that we do by default because of our gender bent that God doesn't ask us to do. He asks us to do the thing that by our gender bent we don't tend to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because
So
that's what it refers to in the beginning when we said that we'll always be wanting to be more men. And
Yeah, in Genesis 3,
So-
yes.
so it's basically asking us to not.
Yes. Oh, that's good. Look at you. I mean, you're tying those things together. That's really insightful. It's
It's very interesting.
It is, isn't it? So like God says, cherish her. Like listen to the way he describes it. Love her as you would yourself. Do you hate your own body? Okay, well look at her as if she's your own body. Well, guys won't do that naturally. And so they will say, she's an accoutrement to my life. She's a trophy. I mean, I love her. She's beautiful. She tells me that I've made it in some ways. And then God says to her, now serve her, lay down your life for her, and treat her as if she's your own body. I was like, oh, wow, that's a lot more sacrifice than I had in mind, if I'm a guy. And a lot more cherishing, right? Like, I'll respect the heck out of her. Like, my wife does 5 things excellently at the same time. I can't do that. I respect the heck out of her. It's easy for me. It's not as easy for me to cherish her, to treat her like the apple of my eye, to say, I was thinking about you today. You matter to me. You're so down the middle of what matters to me, okay? And similarly with my wife, it's easy for her to cherish me. To just say, oh, well, here, I'll do 56 things and they're almost all for you. I've revolved my life around you. But when I talk to you, I may not use very respectful language. Right? And I won't talk to you like you're awesome. I might talk to you like you're 3. It happens. It happens a lot.
Sometimes it's
All right.
warranted.
Oh yeah. Sorry. We're speaking in broad generalities here, but we're going to, why would God give men and women different sort of injunctions in marriage? And you're on it. I think you're on it. It's because God knows how we're made. And that he made us, and so he knows the thing to spur women onto is respect, and the thing to spur men onto is this cherishing love. This thing. I'm glad you made us go back to that. Okay, shall we keep going? Who or what decides an interpretation of the Bible is wrong? I'm going to turn this over to James a little bit. Who says, James, that this is what the Bible teaches? We're on number 14.
Yours is
I don't know, mine are
Wait,
different.
Yeah.
How have
that one got deleted.
Well, it's probably because there's been additions.
Oh,
that
that's right,
aren't
we added
included
so
on
much.
this.
Which,
So my confers are also incorrect.
yes, so you're on a false edition of the Holy Scripture. So who or what decides an interpretation of the Bible is wrong? For example, mixed race marriages were wrong according to the Bible. Let's pause right there for a second. That example, and I think, Christian, that's your example. That actually is not what the Bible teaches. What the Bible taught was don't marry people from different cultures.
Right, this is going back.
And the
to
question is
Leviticus.
why?
Yeah,
right.
This is going back to Leviticus.
Now-
This is the separateness thing.
So was that about don't marry people whose skin is darker than you? Do you think that's what that was about?
Oh, that's just coming from outward influence from
Right.
where I grew up.
And so the Bible never says don't marry someone of a different race. In fact, there's about 5 or 6 different examples of probable mixed marriages in the Bible. The question, Moses is one of them. Moses married Zipporah, and she was from Midian, and she was probably of African descent, and so, or Egyptian, and Moses was Semitic. So we already out of the gate might be misunderstanding what the Bible, again, prescription, description. The Bible is prescribing that that the Jews must not marry outside their tribe. Why? Is it because their race is superior?
It's equally yoked.
Yes, it's an issue of spirituality explicitly in the text. So don't marry someone from outside of Israel. Answer, why? Because they will lead you to worship their gods.
Yeah, I guess what Solomon did. You guys know what Solomon is, right? Smart, like the smartest guy ever. Like super intelligent. Guess what he did? Married a bunch of women that were
1,000, by the way, and no lie.
And then guess what he did after that? And this is funny. He wrote Proverbs that said not to do this.
Yes.
Like he wrote Proverbs to himself not to do what he did.
Yep.
And then he did it.
Yes.
And
Not smart.
and then all the stuff that he said would happen happened.
Wisest man, but I guess not wise enough. Okay, so as an example, who gets to say, well, first of all, we have to read the Bible deeply, first of all, to understand what it's saying just on its face. So, for example, is it prescribing slavery when the New Testament says slaves obey your masters? Is it prescribing slavery, or is it undermining slavery? And so these are really, really important interpretive questions. Now, I won't say it's all easy, okay? But in the case of mixed marriage, there's a real obvious meaning to that text on the surface that doesn't mean don't marry outside your race because marrying a person with different skin color is bad. It's don't marry outside your tribe for spiritual reasons. And then, for example, and what if 100 years we interpret the Bible differently again? And the joke here is that, we have no idea how bigoted we're going to look in 10 years. So that's a great question.
What about something like divorce? A little easier to, like, in the divorce is not something that's sanctioned in the Bible, but
Right.
it's something that's openly accepted now in Christian
And
faith.
was once shunned or shamed.
Very much so. So
Yeah.
that could be a better example than marrying.
It can. So in a case like that, the question is, we have to unspool it back to the value. And where it's controversial is over here, back over here it's not. And so back where it's not controversial is what is God's design for marriage? And it's explicit, and this is from Genesis to Revelation, Jesus, Moses, Paul, everybody. One man, one woman for life. That's the marriage model. So now we're left in the controversial pieces here of when is this justified and not sinful? When is it sinful but forgivable and we need to, offer grace and new starts? When is it an issue for church discipline? Okay, that's controversial stuff back here. So another Bible principle, argue from the clear to the unclear. So what is clear is the marriage model. And then we have to have a debate on our hands. What did Jesus mean when he said, anyone who divorces his wife commits adultery? And anyone who marries a divorced woman causes her to commit adultery. What does he mean by that? What, except, he says, in the case of fornication or porneia, which is the word for sexual immorality broadly. What does he mean? Well, gallons of ink have been spilled over that exception clause. Because if you want to divorce justifiably as a Christian, you want to come in under that clause. Anyone who divorces his wife causes her to commit, in other words, it's an act of adultery to divorce. That's according to Jesus. Except, and except what? Right? We want to know, what's the exception clause? And he says, except for porneia, that's the Greek word, fornication, or it's sometimes translated as sexual immorality. It's very broad. It's not the word adultery. So that's where Christians will debate. So I'm laying out a biblical a principle for interpretation. Let's go from the clear to the unclear, and that helps us.
The reason that we have hermeneutics and the principles around biblical interpretation is because we know as human beings that we are subjective in our nature. And we know, based on human history, that culture changes over time. Our ideas change over time. What we think is right or wrong or good and evil changes over time. That's why having an objective standard is so important for the Christian. That objective standard is what's in Scripture. So if you ignore the biblical principles of interpretation, there are two big ones. There's two goals. First goal, who is God and what is he like? When we study the Bible, that's what we want to know. We want to know who God is and what he's like. And the second goal is, what is the plain meaning of the text? What does the Bible say? Not what do we want it to say, what does it say? And that means that whatever culture you find yourself in, whether it's this one or 100 years from now, when our ideas about things will change, we're constantly butting up against those objective standards. And if we're following good biblical interpretation based on those two first goals and taking context and everything else that goes along with it in mind, we'll break ourselves upon those objective standards. That's what's supposed to happen. Studying Scripture is almost an act of violence, against yourself. You know what I mean? If you're not being challenged and maybe even offended by Scripture study, you're probably not doing it right. It's challenging.
Yeah. If you
pushes
agree with
back
Jesus, yeah.
against you and your preconceptions about what's good and evil, and the one who actually has authority to declare what's good and evil says, well, this is good and this is evil. I had a conversation with a new Christian convert. This is back in 2015. And she said, when I gave my life to Jesus, overnight, my mind changed on a couple things. For example, her ideas about abortion changed overnight. But she was still sort of, okay with the idea of gay marriage. And what I told her was to keep studying. I mean, some things are going to change overnight. Some things God will change your mind over time. And he gets that. He's not just going to make you change your mind on things. The more you study, the more you get into relationship with him, the more you're exposed to him, and the more he penetrates your heart and your mind, the more you will align to his way of doing things and understanding that he's the owner of identity. And that is kind of that's the process, whether it's now or 1,000 years from now.
Which is why you can look at the Scripture and it's kind of like a constant correction. So we think that the moral progress is just going in one direction like this. But really it's doing this. Morality, ethics are just doing this. And they're circling around a center, which is God. And so if I'm living in the Middle Ages, I've got a really high view of honor, like super high view of honor. Like I'm going to keep my word at the expense of my own blood. That's how important honor is. I'm also going to be incredibly violent. And if you offend me, I'm going to probably kill you. Okay? And then we cycle around to, we're going to love our neighbor and we're going to bend ourselves over backwards to do kind things to people who don't deserve it. And then we're also going to just indulge and create dependency and awfulness in a generation that doesn't know how to be responsible. Which of these two cultures is better? Right? It's just keep going around and around. C.S. Lewis talked about it like this. He said, if you can understand how hideous the violence of the Middle Ages, let's say, was to you, then you can understand how our softness and carnality looks to them. And you have no idea how awful we look to them.
Sorry.
Yeah, jump in.
Last 10 minutes, could be pushed to the
Yeah.
5 o'clock.
Yeah.
No, I'm saying could be pushed.
Yeah, let's keep going. You're just
Yeah.
saying keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, very good. So let's keep going with world religions. Aren't all religions fundamentally the same? I'm going to make a comment and then you tell me what you think about this. The assumption in the world is that all religions are fundamentally the same on the inside, but there's wild superficial differences. And my contention is it's exactly the opposite. That world religions have wild fundamental differences on the inside and they have superficial similarities. And so that means at the outside where it relates specifically to, where it specifically relates to morals. If you look at the moral code of Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, and Christianity, they're almost identical. They're almost identical. So on the surface level, ethics, there's incredible unanimity. Ethics. But on the inside, where it comes to like fundamental principle, there's just wild dissimilarity. So for example, everybody believes do not murder, do not steal, brotherhood of man, all that kind of stuff. Ethics. Ethically, we have all sorts of similarities. Here, where it comes to the nature of God, wild and incompatible differences. So what's God like? Well, in Hinduism, God is an emergent energy that comes from all living things. Buddhism is indifferent to the very question of God. Islam, God is utterly transcendent, cannot even be almost beyond personality, and is wildly, definitely not a trinity. There's no plurality in God in Islam. In fact, that's just utterly just incongruent. And the most defining characteristic of God is God's transcendent power, his sovereignty in Islam. In Judaism, God is a lawgiver. And in Christianity, God is triune. There's three persons in one being. God is an eternal community in Christianity. These things are fundamentally incompatible. They don't get along at the level of their fundamental principle. So what do you think about that? We tend to think they're the same on the inside, but really they're only the same on the outside. And what does that mean? If they're fundamentally different here, the law of non-contradiction must apply. And what would that be, James? What's the law of non-contradiction?
A is A. A cannot be A and also B at the same time. Or A cannot be A and also not A at the same time.
So God is impersonal, an emergent energy from all living things, versus God is personal. These cannot go together.
Can't be the same.
They can't be the same. These
the
religions
universe
can't be the same thing fundamentally. They
The
are
universe
different.
was created and also random at the same time.
There you go. These are incongruent ideas. So what does that mean? That means that we don't get off the hook for truth seeking just because we think, well, everybody's religious and so who am I to judge? It's like you're not called to judge your neighbor, but you are called to judge your own perception of what's true. And you're not allowed, it's some sort of get out of jail free card to say, well, it's probably all the same anyhow somewhere, so no big deal.
Yeah, the person who said that hasn't dug in very much.
Right. Now the parable, anybody heard the parable of the blind man and the elephant?
I have.
Okay, what is it?
Okay, there's several. Usually there are 3 or 4 blind men.
Okay.
They come inside the palace of a king. And inside the palace of the king is an elephant. And the 3 or 4 blind men have never actually encountered an elephant before. So each of them approaches the elephant and they start to, touch it. One's got the tail and thinks, aha, an elephant is like a mouse. One is touching the trunk and says, aha, an elephant is like a snake. And you guys get the idea. Okay, so they're all kind of getting an incomplete picture of the elephant. And of course, outside of that is the king who's observing all this. And he knows that it's actually an elephant and that there's blind men. For whatever reason in the parable, he doesn't bother to tell them. He just sort of watches them amused. That's
Tisk, tisk.
the idea of the parable is everybody who is attempting to evaluate religious worldviews they're all trying to evaluate the same thing. They're just not getting the whole picture, and therefore everybody's right. That's usually what that argument.
God is a rope. No, God is a fan. God is a hose. Okay? And the point that the religious pluralist is making is what? What is the religious pluralist who believes all religions are fundamentally the same? What are they trying to say by this illustration?
They're all right.
It's all the same. They're equally wrong and they're equally right.
They all have a piece of the puzzle.
They have a
but it's
piece of
too
the
hard
puzzle.
for us to get the whole picture.
Why is this self-defeating as an illustration? Like, why does it just not make sense?
God isn't a rope.
Right. God in this illustration is an elephant. He's not a rope. They're all wrong. And not just because God is actually something. Like so it's if the Hindu says God is a rope, then God is not a rope. God is an elephant. And this person says God is a fan. That person is wrong. God is not a fan. God is an elephant. An elephant is a whole thing. And you say, well, they've got some part of it. Well, Christians don't have to deny that. When the Hindu says the pathway to enlightenment is right action, right thought, right behavior, we go, you got a piece of the pie. No different than we do. Do not lie, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal. We're just singing the same song, right? In that way, then this is true. But notice there's someone who objectively sees reality for who it is. So when the religious pluralist says all religions are the same, they're just describing different parts of God, the question you should ask that person is, how do you know that?
Are you the blind man or are you the king in this
Yeah.
illustration?
Are you the king? You can't make this illustration unless you think you're this guy. You are this guy.
Yeah. If they say
You
they're
see
the
it the way it really is.
king, that's pretty. It's arrogant.
It
If they
is.
say, "Oh, I'm the king," in this, like,
Okay.
are you sure?
So why are you staying silent?
Someone says God would not reveal himself in only one religion. You go, how do you know God so well? How do you know God so well that he would not do that? Well, he just wouldn't. Oh, okay, that's not an argument, right? So you can see that we want religious pluralism to be true because on one hand we think it's humble, but it actually turns out to be arrogant because it puts us, the religious pluralists, in the position of being the person, I see what it really is. You dumb Christians, huh? You see a little piece, you've got this whole Trinity thing. And it's just, wow. You're seeing a tiny little, you're seeing this piece. Oh, how do you know that? You know? Oh, because you think you see it the way it really is. This person sees objective reality. Ironically telling you that religions are all subjective. Isn't that interesting?
That person has the special knowledge because they got their eyesight.
Yes, exactly. You're blind, but they see. So it doesn't work. It's a self-defeating illustration. Okay. So where did Christianity and Judaism part ways theologically? At Jesus. Which one is right? Well, it all comes back down to whether Jesus rose from the dead. If Jesus rose from the dead, he authenticates his claim to be the Messiah. And now the question is, can you just objectively look at the messianic thumbprint from the Old Testament and see that Jesus fit that thumbprint? You can. But a lot of Jews don't, and that's because they take some of the obvious things like Isaiah 53 and spiritualize them, and we look at them differently. But fundamentally then, did Jesus deserve to rewrite the book because he is God? Did God through Jesus, a Jewish man, want to reform Judaism, or was his intention a clean break from it?
We
And-
just answered that. He was there to beg for the moral law, right?
Yeah, like I would say that.
It's a fulfillment. more than
Yeah,
anything else.
the question is good, but it needs to be modified because Jesus, it's not binary. Jesus wanted to fulfill Moses. He said, I did not come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. So he's not, the clean break idea is probably a wrong way to think. He did not want a clean break from Judaism. He came to fulfill Judaism. He is Judaism's answer to the world. And
If
so,
they had acknowledged him as the Messiah, then it just would have continued on, right?
Yes.
Judaism would have become Christianity.
exactly. In the same way that Martin Luther had his way, there would be no Protestantism. There would just be Reformed Church.
Right.
There would just be Catholicism Reformed. It would just be, we would all be Catholics still. How did Christianity begin to spread? By the preaching of the apostles all around the Roman Empire. And by the way, we have excellent extra biblical evidence that it got to Rome before the end, before 70 AD. Josephus wrote, he is a Jewish historian, and he wrote that they were talking about Jesus and being persecuted in Rome by Nero in 65. So Christianity got from Jerusalem to Rome in 40 years. The Quran, the Torah, and the Bible all came from the same geographical location, so who's to say that there aren't parts of them to be equally true?
It seems like, again, this comes to that drawing again. It seems like there's pieces of truth in some of those documents, but no one's seen a whole picture of it, right?
True, but there's some objective ways that we can evaluate. For example, when Muhammad tells you Jesus was X, and he writes in 700, that's what he writes, 600, sorry, and he writes in the 620s. And then Paul says Jesus was Y, and he writes in 55. Who do we have an automatic bias to believe?
Paul,
Why? Why would we believe Paul over Muhammad?
because he would be closer to where Jesus lived.
Makes sense to me, yeah. Because he lived closer in time and closer in geography. Don't you think that that would be natural? Like, who do you trust to know more about Canada, me or this guy?
James.
Come on, man! I lived there for 21 years.
There's
Okay,
also
that makes sense, right? Like, you trust a person who's there closer geographically and closer in terms of time.
there's also ways you can evaluate their transmission over time, their variance. So there's that you can evaluate. You can evaluate their the historical evidence for things like names of places, names of kings, names of rulers. These are all things you can do. What else? A comparison of the model of writing. So here's one of the difficulties when you have the dictation model. We always talked about
Facts from heaven.
Yeah, like the dictation model versus the inspiration model of written scripture. In the dictation model, you're literally just sitting there going, okay, T-H-E. Okay, and then you're writing. That's the dictation model. You're not really thinking, you're just doing what you're told. Take these notes. Versus inspiration of the Bible, where the authors still have their faculties. They're still inserting their own wit, humor,
Personality.
their personality,
Yeah,
like
it's all
all
in
the
there.
literary devices that we expect to see when we have our faculties about us when we're writing. What does it do to your evaluation of the truth claims of a book written in the dictation model that contains errors? It
Yeah.
better be perfect, right?
Yeah, it blows it up.
Like if you're interviewing somebody for a job and they're kind of being a jerk, and you're like, oh man, your answers better be A+.
Yeah.
You better, because you know what I mean. You're just like,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna hire you. You're a jerk.
Yeah.
So as soon as
If
you
it's a
find
facts
errors-
from heaven.
Exactly. If it's a facts from heaven, there better not be errors in it. And if there are, you better have a really good explanation. So you can evaluate it based on that too.
So you have all sorts of objective. We don't even have to go to the principles. Now, where the principles are the same, Jesus had a mother, her name was Mary. Well, guess what? The Quran says that. In fact, did you know this? The Quran teaches that Mary was a virgin when she had Jesus. So the Quran teaches the virgin birth of Jesus from a distance of 600 years later. But the Quran is adamant that God has no sons, that Allah has no sons. In other words, that the idea of the Trinity is an abominable heresy.
And what's weird is that they will still acknowledge that Jesus was a prophet, or was a valid
Absolutely.
prophet. In Judaism, if a prophet gets it wrong, Deuteronomy
Yeah,
18:22.
18, yeah.
If a prophet says, the Lord said, and it doesn't happen, guess what happens to that prophet?
They get beheaded.
Capital offense.
It's a capital offense. Not only are you like, okay, God
Stoned.
didn't say that, ignore what
They
they
didn't
said.
decapitate. They
And,
just stoned.
and you know,
Threw
you're
rocks.
done
Ah,
because you
yeah.
ascribed to God something that he didn't say.
Yeah.
So
Big
what's
deal.
weird is that in Islam, you can have a guy say, no, I'm the son of God. And in Islam, he still retains his role as prophet. Whereas in Judaism, they rightly reject him entirely, saying, no, he was a crackpot. He wasn't the son of God. He was a looney tune.
Yeah.
That's at least a consistent view. It doesn't make any sense
Yeah.
to have the Quran say, oh yeah.
Right. So yeah, on one hand, then we said the Quran is split up quite a bit in terms of its bellicose passages, which are the angry passages of war, and the peaceful passages, and they are chronologically separated based on Muhammad's story. So when Muhammad was trying to get along with everybody in Medina, and there was Jews and Christians and pagans floating around, it was like, everybody get along, and we're going to be, if you follow the Bible, you should continue to follow the Bible, and all you pagans, he was really trying to convert pagans to a strict monotheism. And then once they took over Mecca, then it got warlike. But yeah, so the basic idea is where they're the same, it was just like, oh yeah, I guess that's a confirmation of an idea that was pervasive. Where they're different, then we evaluate them. Well, who's telling the truth? Who's closer to the events? Who has confirmation of their part of that story? And if there's no confirmation for Muhammad in 600 of his particular view of Jesus, then we have a good reason to have a bias towards the authenticity of the New Testament over the Quran. All right, so that's 8 o'clock. So let's pause there. And we're not going to meet next week because that's Memorial Day. But we'll go the week after that and we'll see how far we get. Sound good? And as always, you guys, if you have questions in between now and then, you can throw them out to me. I know we still have a lot to go, but I just don't want to feel like you guys have a capper. You can't ask a question because sometimes we cycle back and we pick up really good stuff. Okay, so let's close this in prayer, and then we'll let you guys go. God, we want to be good, and tonight the conversation was about goodness. But now we're left with the subjectivity of this whole thing. Is my version of goodness and my neighbor's version of goodness? And is there not a truth above all truth? Is there not a law above all laws? And God, if there is, it comes from you. There has to, if you are the source of goodness, then there has to be that source that lives outside my brain and my wants and just lives in the world. And I pray that you would reveal that to us and that we would conform ourselves to that standard. And when we find ourselves on the rough end of that, judged by the law that's revealed even in our own hearts, that we would know what to do with that conviction, that we would run to you for grace and for mercy, for a new start and for new life. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, kids, I love this class. You guys are just